TSB investigator Greg Feith, and NBC's own Tom Costello, who covers aviation. Tom, I want to begin with you. And I mean, this happened at 38,000 feet when the pilot got out, apparently to use the restroom, and this first officer locked the door and began this descent. Is this just an act of opportunity?
Yeah, and in the last few minutes, the German authorities there, Lufthansa, I should say, have really kind of given us more details on how this happened. In the United States, if a pilot comes out to use the restroom, the procedure is for a flight attendant to go in and kind of stand inside the cockpit, stand guard, to ensure that the pilot who's flying the plane doesn't have a medical emergency, and then to let the original pilot back in. That does not happen in Germany. Lufthansa says that is not our policy. What happens is the pilot who's left to go to the restroom then essentially rings a doorbell, if you will, and it's up to the pilot inside who's flying to look on a closed-circuit television monitor and say, okay, yes, that's the captain, I'm going to let him in, and open the door. But in this case, the co-pilot didn't let the captain back in. There's an emergency code that the captain can type in if he wants to get back in, assuming that, for example, he leaves and somebody inside's had a heart attack, but that can be overridden by the person inside. So, in fact, this was a deliberate act, the co-pilot overriding the captain who was trying to get into the cockpit. The other point here, I'm not so sure that I agree with French prosecutors who say that people on the plane didn't know what was happening. If you've got the captain banging on the door, as apparently was the case, and screaming and shouting to get in, and the plane's descending, I got to believe that quite a few passengers may have been aware that something wasn't right.
Yeah, and Tom, it's just amazing that this first officer said nothing to the pilot who was trying to gain access to the cockpit, and nothing to the ground controllers who were trying to reach him. All they heard on that cockpit voice recorder was the sound of his normal breathing.
French prosecutors are very sure that he was not himself having a medical issue because it sounded normal, his breathing, but also because he apparently was overriding that switch, not allowing the captain in. There's a 5-minute break. If somebody doesn't override the switch over that 5-minute period, then the door will unlock if you type in the right code. That did not happen. This was an active effort to keep the captain out.
Let's bring Greg in right now. Greg, this was nothing unusual for this time in a flight. The plane levels off to its cruising altitude and the pilot gets up to use the restroom. It happens every day.
Absolutely, Matt, and that, you know, that's why it sounded so normal up until then the descent happened. Now that we have this new information, that's going to be a concern now for world aviation. We built these fortified doors, we have these security protocols in place, but as we talked about even a year ago with MH370, just because we do something here in the United States as far as security, having a flight attendant in the cockpit, blocking the aisle, if you will, the rest of the world doesn't necessarily operate the same way we do. And that's why I was very surprised that Lufthansa, who is a very good airline, didn't have that same protocol. They left the pilot alone in the cockpit. And now we have a new issue. We've fortified the doors to prevent people from getting into the cockpit. Now we have an issue that is transpiring in the cockpit, and we can't get there to remedy it.
And yet the airline really has no way of knowing. This guy hadn't been in the air that long, 630 hours of flying time, I think 100-plus hours on this aircraft. But I was looking through his record. It looked pretty solid, Greg.
Yeah, and that's a concern, Matt. You can only do so many psychological testing for pilots. They do that normally during an initial employment screen. They'll do psychological testing and that kind of stuff. They do some of that. I know that the CEO of Lufthansa said that they don't have a specific protocol to do that during recurrent training or recurrent medicals. But every AME, every medical doctor that I go to for my pilot certificate in medical, they will talk to you, they'll see what your state of mind is and things like that. I got a feeling protocols are going to change worldwide, especially after this event.
Greg Feith, Tom Costello, guys, thank you both. Again, a deliberate act on the part of the first officer of this Germanwings aircraft crashing that plane into the French Alps. We'll have more in the investigation throughout the morning.